Welcome to the Kaleidoscope Podcast. It's your host, George Salis. Today I'll be in conversation with a special guest, one of my favorite poets, Barton Smock, who hails from Columbus, Ohio. Some of Barton's collections include Ghost Arson and, most recently, Wasp, Gasp. I first encountered Barton's work in the form of infant cinema back in late 2020. The following is a taste of the imagery you can find in his poetry. Ear-shaped mirrors, spacesuits for stillborns, the owl with hands, the spider's trail of abandoned birthmarks. To appreciate Barton's work, one must learn to take pleasure in balancing on the fringe of the unknown while admiring the abyssal veil that stretches before you with scintillations that echo fallen stars. Simply put, to read him is to dream. In our conversation, Barton and I discuss everything from death metal to Instagram poetry. So, without further ado, please enjoy our exchange. Hey, Bart, how's it going?
It's going well, going well.
Thanks for being on the show. It's a long time coming. And yeah, I want to just get started and ask you, how did you come to poetry? Or another way to look at it is, how did poetry come to you?
I think that, it's always kind of been arriving and departing. I'll say that early on, I think, growing up in kind of a conservative Christian household, Psalms and Proverbs were probably how it first came to me. Also, I heard both my parents sang in church. My father was a traditional gospel singer, and my mother would make her own little songs on keyboard herself, write her own lyrics. And so I think that was very informed my early comings to poetry, in that, there was the undercurrent of the traditional, along with like, hey, I'm just going to do this shit myself. And I think I kind of got a lot from that.
Were you a choir boy, perchance?
I was not a choir boy. I did lead our youth group a couple times, and did some homilies. They weren't actually called homilies because it wasn't Catholic, but I did some of those things at the request of my parents. But I don't know if that was necessarily finding my voice or not. That was just doing what I was told.
Well, how did it progress from there?
I think from there, I just looking for things outside of the realm of anything conservative or Christian. I got into death metal. I mean, I remember reading the inlays of cassette tapes, like they were gospel, so like death metal lyrics. And from there, probably, I got into beat poetry with one of my younger brothers, and that kind of all coalesced into, probably 1994. Probably found myself in a bookstore just wanting to read anything that wasn't what I was supposed to be reading, anything with a lot of white space. And I remember picking up it's a book by Mark Strand. Had never heard of him before. And the very first page I opened it to, there was a poem called Nostalgia. And the last line of that poem, and I hope I'm not misquoting it, but it was, it is yesterday, it is still yesterday. And I just remember, that stopped me right there in my bliss and boredom of 1994. And I was like, I think this is the stuff for my salt brain or whatever, this poetry. And from there it was like Charles Simic, Yusuf Komunyakaa, and
at what point when reading these authors did you decide you wanted to try your hand at poetry officially?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd always written what I considered to be lyrics, and I just started kind of from there. I kind of went back into things I had been writing before, same obsessions, same types of things, but approached them with I was bent on copying at first, of course.
Mm.
But yeah, I
We've
think
all been there.
yeah. So yeah, I think it gave me a way to language my obsessions in a way that wasn't just in a way that wasn't just anti, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't just rebelling against something. I was actually trying to figure out why these are my obsessions. And I think poetry kind of gave me an inroad to that other things I'd experienced hadn't.
You must have been shocked reading death metal lyrics after supping at the gospel
Yeah,
type lyrics.
absolutely. And I always felt it was kind of interesting because you know, late 80s, of course, there was the satanic panic and all that kind of thing. But I always kind of felt like those people were, those bands were using death metal as a way to deal with trauma. And they were taking this very thing that's not real, you know, Satan and hell, and but they were using that to language their own trauma. I never really felt like, even if someone I was listening to said they, you know, worship Satan, I never believed it.
Yeah, it's less from a sense of belief than disbelief and shock, if not provocation. And then I agree with you about the therapeutic element. I remember seeing an interview with Alex Webster of Cannibal Corpse, and he goes on to explain how he's taking, you know, the baser impulses and the need to sort of have an outburst and turning that into a kind of art, and going to a show in the mosh pit is therapeutic. People care for each other and pick each other up.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
there tends to be one asshole in the group at least, but
there always is. But he always gets thrown out. Like, I remember I felt safest at mosh pits. I was, you know, a skinny bunch of nothing dude, and in the camaraderie and the, you know, when there was someone that was just in there to hurt people, you know, there'd be 4 or 5 guys that would be like, yeah, we're getting that guy out of here, or we're going to circle this person. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, what was the poetry like in the early stages? How would you compare those first attempts with, you know, what you do now?
I think there was a lot of just writing about everyday things, looking at something and saying, hey, I do this, I do that, and I'm just going to write about this. And there was a lot of you know, copying, and a lot of just kind of saying things in a way that I thought sounded poetic. So I think that by virtue of doing it a lot, I think every now and then I would hit on something that was real or true, but that wasn't really my goal. My goal was kind of to get all the writing out of the way, so that I could actually, like, you know, engage with what I was reading and writing at the same time.
Definitely.
So
you
yeah.
said you were reaching towards something, or you occasionally you would bump into something that sounded poetic, which brings me to my next question. And I've asked you this before, but I want to get into the weeds with you a little more on it. And I asked you what makes a poem a poem. And when I interviewed you for the Kaleidoscope in 2019, you mentioned that a poem is a great avoidance, or a sudden thing, or both. So let's start with the first bit. What do you mean by a great avoidance in this context?
So yeah, I'd say that like I kind of bristle at sitting down to, like, hey, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to write about this thing, I'm going to tackle it, or I'm going to actually say something. So a lot of times in what I read or what I'm trying to write, sometimes I recognize when people are writing around something, because they're not because they're afraid of it, but because they're kind of angry at the command, I guess, to write. And that's always interesting to me, because, you know, you'll read things and there is that avoidance, but it's not avoidance in the fact that someone is trying to not face something. It's the fact that writing in itself is an act. So it seems like a command sometimes, or it seems like someone's asking you to do it, and there's nothing that'll make you less poetic than doing something on command. So that's kind of what I meant by avoidance. You can sense, that great avoidance in things where someone's like, I want to say something, but like I really want to say it with other things rather than saying it flat out.
Yes. And, I have people asking me, how do you spend 10 years on a project writing a novel? I just finished a 10-year novel. And how do you do this? And I mean, it's a balance between titillating a fickle muse and having the compulsion, as you put it, to put ass in seat. But it's a necessity. Otherwise, if you don't put ass in seat, you're not going to get much work done at all, I don't think. I mean, What do you think of that?
No, I totally agree. I also feel like it's always interesting when, I would assume that when people ask you that, you probably are like, I didn't spend 10 years doing one thing. I spent 10 years doing many, many fucking things that this work, either swallowed or spit out or
yes,
whatever. So you absolutely have to do it, and you absolutely have to attack it, or however you want to phrase it. But yeah, 10 years doing any amount of things as that you're trying to interpret or figure out why you're there in the first place, like that. That's a worthy endeavor. It's not you're not wasting time on one thing. You're actually giving time back to many things that might not have been revealed had you not given them your eyesight or attention.
What's the longest amount of time you've spent on a poem or a series of poems?
I'd say, geez, so I put out a collection. So, as you know, I write often, and I kind of write to disappear and write quickly, but it doesn't really feel like that to me. I feel like I'm in conversation with things all the time. But yeah, I remember when I first, things started with MySpace, and that's when I started actually giving titles to things. And then, got a little bit of an audience and engaged with some other writers. And then that morphed into a lot of other things, but I started self-publishing, but it was more of like, hey, I don't have any file folders. I didn't print this stuff out. So I'm going to start self-publishing so I can buy it myself. And then I have a record of what I wrote. Right. And then I got interested in actually like, hey, wait, maybe I can have a collection that actually means something, or I can order these in a way. So then I started doing that, but I remember I got kind of addicted to, hey, every 3 months I'm just going to put something out, make my $20 or whatever, the 3 people that bought it or whatever, and I'm just going to keep doing this. And then I kind of got tired of that, so I remember I went pretty much a whole year. I don't remember exactly what year it was, but I went a very long time, and I put everything. I had this title. It was Eating the Animal Back to Life, and every time I was writing something, I had that title in the back of my mind, hoping that I would kind of write toward that title. And I'd say that was probably the longest time that I actually worked on something, even though they were individual poems and everything. I did put a lot into that book, as I do in all mine, but I think that was the one that I did things differently than I normally do. And lo and behold, that comes out. I do very few readings, but I happened to get invited to this reading in Cleveland, and I met a guy there who had a bookstore in Cleveland, and I brought that book, and he took it and he said he's going to put it in his bookstore. And like 2 years later, the writer Kazim Ali emailed me, said, hey, I found your book in a bookstore in Cleveland, Eating the Animal Back to Life, and I love it. And he ended up writing about it on Poetry's blog about like books you should buy, which it wasn't available anymore at that point, because I deleted it. But but I felt good that I had set out to do something with that one, and that ended up being the one that kind of, um, got me some notice by people I like respected
Nice.
and this and that. But that was probably the longest I've ever actually worked on.
Well, now I'm thinking of Cannibal Corpse's first album, Eaten Back to Life.
Good Lord.
Is that the death metal influence sort of
you know what?
coming back to life?
That might have been. I did not even. Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure all of that was in there somewhere. That's funny because my son Noah listens to Cannibal Corpse now, and he thought he found them. He was like telling me about them.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, dude, I've been there.
Been there, done that. Well,
yeah.
I was also thinking of Don DeLillo. Some of the stories he wrote, he had the title first, and he wanted to justify the existence of the title, and so he wrote a story. And I found myself doing that to one degree or another in Morphological Echoes. Is that something you could relate to on a regular basis, or was that a one-off thing?
Oh no, absolutely. I often have titles first, and even if they don't end up getting used, that's kind of and you've probably noticed that some of my poems all have the same title. That's kind of how I go about that now. Instead of working on something and just being, it's like I'm just going to give them all the same title and hope I write toward it, especially if it was interesting to me as I was doing that. But yeah, I almost always have titles first, even if I erase them, delete them, or end up calling them untitled. They had something first that came ahead of time, and I think that comes from like when I used to write lyrics. I'd always have the title first, and then I write rhymes to that title. So.
And what about the sudden thing? Because you mentioned a poem is a great avoidance, which we discussed, but also it can be a sudden thing.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are poems. I mean, and you always, if you're going to do the sudden thing, you better stick the landing. But yeah, I'd say some of the poems that have taken my breath is they'll have that last line that it doesn't necessarily pull it all together, but it definitely destroys it. Like I think that talent, obsession, possession, in knowing what you're reading, you can always put some pretty things together, and you can always get at something. But if you can have that extra sudden thing that says, hey, this isn't just everything I've been thinking, or this isn't all my influences. This is a line that blew it up for me as well. That's always just very noticeable when there's that sudden thing in a poem that just kind of makes it something else, or else ends it kind of like disappears on that last line or something.
And as a poet, I think it might be in some sense more convenient to be susceptible to sudden things, because me as the writer of big novels, I mean, I can write notes on my phone, a line, a phrase, a word, at best a paragraph, but I'm not going to be on the go writing more than that. But as a poet, technically, in theory, you could write a poem on the go. Do you find yourself doing something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, I mean, especially with kind of the online living, and the online afterlife of some things, I think there's a way to be in conversation and in constant thought. I see writers I admire, or people I admire, writing one-offs about current situations on Twitter or on anything, and they're brilliant. And I find I want to reply to those things or be in conversation with them. So I think that the way that I have positioned myself, I'm kind of always on the go, in terms of like, hey, I'm reading this, I'm going over here, 30 windows open, and trying to have my little, Microsoft Word document up that I'm writing my own stuff in. And it all kind of feels like it's all of a piece. So which also sometimes is anathema to the sudden thing, because
Yes.
if you feel you're constantly just commenting or narrating or being notified, it's kind of hard sometimes, even if you write short poems or whatever. It's the sudden thing is still elusive, because it feels like a constant. But so yeah, that's something I've had to kind of fold into my work, and also recognize that it's happening, so that I can get some downtime and still engage with my own obsessions, as opposed to like trying to drop in on everyone else's.
I'm wondering, how do you feel about, I guess it's a trend these days, poetry that not only is it free verse and totally devoid of something like a traditional form, but it tends to be devoid of what I consider poetry, which is to be the collision or the pairing of unexpected words and imagery. And instead, a lot of the popular poetry I've come across seems like nonfiction with line breaks that is quotidian to the core.
Yeah, well, I think especially with everything being kind of used to, when you were writing poetry or whatever, you had a way of how you wanted it to look on the page. So I feel like even if I was writing paragraphs, like I knew where I wanted to have my spaces, and I knew when I wanted a new page to start if I was writing a story or something. And with poems, I was always like, hey, here's a line break, or here's a space, and I had an image of how I wanted it to look on the page. And I think, especially on Instagram and places like that, you see it now all the time, where something that looks like a poem, if you didn't read it, you'd look at it and be like, that looks kind of pretty, or that looks like a nice little piece of block this with that. I think there's a visual sense that is kind of taken over, and then people are attracted to that, and then they read it and it says something that is very, it's like, yeah, I'm not going to argue with it. It's nice to say that, like, nobody space should die. I mean, no one's going to argue with that. But it doesn't forgive the fact that it's like awful writing. Yeah, so I mean, I think on Instagram especially, I mean, I get annoyed sometimes because, some of my stuff on Instagram in terms of form looks like what they call Instagram poetry. But, I'm very much against what is called Instagram poetry, where it's just like, my dog died, I am sad, which, on its own could be, in context of other things, could be something beautiful or whatever, but you can't just write a sentence and break it up and then put a title on it. And most of these people don't even have a title. It's like you didn't even like go to the trouble of like coming up with a creative title for something so basic, which would be funny, right? If you had this like wonderfully verbose, great title, and then you wrote something very like kind of basic and boring, that actually would be interesting.
As a juxtaposition, if nothing else.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're here to, above all, celebrate your newest collection titled Wasp, Gasp. It was published late 2023 by Incunabula Media. And you told me you only agreed to the book's publication because the press would allow you to use your son, Noah Michael Smock's, cover art. So what can you tell me first about the book in general, and then about the cover art in particular?
Well, yeah. So David Mitchell at Incunabula, he had actually reached out to me. I noticed that he had suddenly been very engaged with my work on Instagram, and he said, "Hey, I would love to publish your next work if you have anything you're working on." He said that it wouldn't be. He said it wouldn't be. Monetary wise, it wouldn't be anything more than what I do with my self-publishing. He just wanted to be involved. He felt like, he said, I read your stuff and I cry, and that has to mean something. And it was actually in his pitch that he said, and I was also wondering if you are open to it. I had written a self-published collection called Dear As Permission to Die in Ohio, that my son Noah had done the cover art for. And so in David Mitchell's pitch to me, he said, I also would be interested in having your son do the cover because I thought the cover he did for that other work was amazing. So the fact that he engaged with my work and then kind of mentioned both the devil and the detail of what me and Noah had done before, I was like, I'm in. Like, I don't usually, I don't really submit. I don't really insist on taking up space. But, if someone's going to do their research and then also say, hey, also, I think, you were correct in the art you saw or in what you saw in your son's art. I didn't feel like I could say no.
Yes. And for people who are listening and can't see the cover art, can you describe it for us?
Yeah. So yeah, we went through a couple iterations of the cover, but around the time I was working on this, I had a dream of this where this kind of body without a head was floating, and it had a light bulb for a penis, and I had kind of written that dream down. I thought that image, but I'm not artistically, as far as making things look visual, I'm not great. So I wrote this really crude drawing, and it didn't look like a light bulb or a penis. But I had that, and then so that was the first idea. When I was approached about it, I was like, I have to get this guy on the cover of my book. So I'd given that to my son Noah, and he kind of did some things with it. And then originally we had I remember Sharon Olds had a book. I think it was called Blood, Tin, Straw or something like that. But anyway, the cover was a bunch of pictures, different, and you had to really look in each square to see what each one was. And we were kind of going for that, but we couldn't get, everything was too small and stuff. So we kind of settled on having one long image, and next to it, kind of broken in two images. And so it's basically the guy with the light bulb for a penis, and then the other two images was a wasp, but we changed that to a frog. I don't remember exactly why, except that I wanted it to look like a bored wasp, but it's kind of hard to make a wasp look bored. So the frog picture looked more bored to me. And then I also wanted it to have some color. And my uncle had recently sent me a picture of, he had a riding mower that caught fire, and he took a picture of it in his driveway ablaze. And for some reason he thought of me when he took that picture. So he sent it to me, and I was like, I want to have something on fire to give it some color. So that was the other picture. It's a little lawnmower on fire. But then when we did it, I actually liked it without color. So then we washed all the color out, and that's the cover we ended up with.
I want to say it's Lynchian, but I guess that Lynchianness is invoked too often these days. But I do love my David Lynch.
But it's okay to invoke it if it's actually Lynchian, then that it's good to invoke it.
True.
Oh, yeah.
So you often invoke God in your poems, which I've commented on, and I think I've asked you about it maybe in some context or another. You mention God and other things continually out of a feeling of fear. Is that true, or am I getting that right?
No, that's correct. I feel it's not always the same God. I'd say it is always the same fear. I think there's an equal fear of if God exists, it's terrifying, and if he doesn't, it's also terrifying. So yeah, I feel like I'm always trying to make God go away, or at least make God come from the future.
Is there a pagan element in there?
Yeah, somewhat. Yeah, and I think you had mentioned it in one of our earlier talks, but kind of the theophobia. Yeah, absolutely. There's some of that in there, but yeah, I think too the way I go. I always kind of want my own writing to be replaced by my own writing. And to me, that's kind of the same way that I engage with God or the God question. It's always there's this overlapping or this erasing thing that happens. and it just comes up a lot in the things I write about.
And how much of that is based on the religious upbringing you had?
I think a lot of it, absolutely. I mean, my parents were by no means fundamentalists, but I didn't. I mean, it wasn't until 1985 or 86 that I was even aware that uh, contemporary gospel music wasn't the only music out there. We didn't have any, not because of fundamentalism, but there wasn't. My parents didn't have like secular hobbies. They didn't have movies and like those kinds of things. They did here and there, but it just was a whole other world. So yeah, absolutely. I think if every now and then I might be trying to go back to 1985 and let myself know what bands were out there and what movies were out there by erasing God from that time period. But I don't know if that's not necessarily my parents or God's fault. That's just kind of, I think, what we all try to do with our childhood a little bit.
Do you consider yourself more religious, less religious than when you were growing up or than your parents?
I mean, to be honest, I like growing up, I was religious in the sense that, like, I remember praying to God for good things and praying to Satan for bad things. I mean, that was kind of my simplistic view of good and evil. That, there were things you didn't want God to know and things like that. But I never really was a believer in any kind of strong sense as far as a God goes in a church setting. Now, the question of God and I find the reason that if you have if man creates God or has to tell a story about God, I'm interested in that. I'm interested in why God exists for people that need Him. I'm religious in that
Yes.
sense, that I do think God exists in a way that they have to exist for some, like God has to exist for some people.
In a kind of communal mass
right
delusion.
Yeah.
Or another, that's probably less diplomatic than you would put it, but another question for you, and I know this is a question that is often asked of poets because there's a bias toward long-form fiction, and I am biased toward long-form fiction. You're one of my few favorite poets who I read. And the question is, have you ever thought of writing a novel?
Not so much anymore. I used to, like, I thought that's where I was going to go. I mean, I think I probably read too much or too little of Cormac McCarthy. I used to write little block paragraphs of prose trying to capture what certain paragraphs of Cormac McCarthy's writing did for me. Because there's always, in any novel you read, or there's always those few entries that kind of invent your breathing, like, and then everything else around it, when those things are so brilliant, everything else around it seems not as brilliant. But I also understand that the build-up and everything wouldn't be there if it weren't for the things around it. But for a little while, I just kind of tried to go directly there. I was like, I'm just going to write paragraphs that seem like they're from great novels, and I'm going to call it prose. And and I tried to write a story, but honestly, I don't think place isn't in my wheelhouse, and time isn't really my music, so I don't think writing a novel would play to my strengths or be very kind to my weaknesses.
There's a Borgesian strategy there. If you consider, say, one of your poems coming from an apocryphal novel that doesn't exist, that's how Borges wrote his short stories. They were about these infinite, complex works, but he never wrote and would never have written those dense, complex works because he thought it was pure insanity.
Well, yeah, maybe I was trying to keep from going insane, which I'll say, I'm not sure how you're not insane from what you've said about morphological echoes.
I mean, it was getting pretty dark near the end.
Was it?
And I don't know how it has changed me on the way out, but that's for other people to judge, I suppose. It's funny you mentioned Cormac McCarthy, because his work tends to have some kind of religious dimension. I mean, he invokes God in various contexts and even touches on the perennial problem of evil. And I remember his rare appearance on the Oprah Winfrey Show. And Oprah, of course, asks him, "Do you believe in God?" And he was squirming a bit in his chair and kind of looking away. And he said, "Well, it depends on what day you ask me." But he was
today on the Oprah Show.
Yeah. But he was friends with theoretical physicist Lawrence Krauss, and he appeared on that documentary with Krauss and Richard Dawkins, The Unbelievers. He appeared near the end, and only after some pepping up or coaxing from his friend Lawrence Krauss. And in a sense, he was a closeted atheist. But I guess that's not something he wanted to necessarily broadcast. Right. I don't know. It just came to my mind.
Well, I do think he had a quote one time where he said, "There's nothing worth writing about except good, evil, and God." I think was a of course everyone has a quote that we're like, yeah, I was 19 and it sounded cool, but I do remember reading that and being like, yeah, I mean, the question of good and evil and God is actually all writing is somewhat about that. But sometimes you have to take a little leap.
And then, of course, when I was reading Johnny Stanton's Mangled Hands, I mentioned you in the introduction I wrote because the prose struck me as Smockian. And I was like, man, this is probably something you would write if you were to.
Well, only if we could get Smockian to be as overused as Lynchian, I'll be happy.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but did you end up flipping through Mangled Hands at all?
I did. I'm very of the moment, like when I'm reading. I like it while I'm doing it, and I have like immediate reactions to it. But if I don't write down my reflection or my response to it, it doesn't. I don't always remember it. So when I think of Mangled Hands, in that time period, I know what it looks like in my head, and it's very vivid to me as far as like a feeling. But I mean, I don't think I could quote like, a paragraph from it or anything like that. But I did remember thinking that it was better than anything I'd ever written. So I was
going to ask if it was like looking into a mirror at all, but maybe I don't know.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, no, yeah, one-way mirror, maybe.
Or a mirror where you have like a six-pack or something.
Yeah, right. Maybe like an interrogation room mirror, where I was trying to figure out, who did it. But yeah, I was definitely impressed and happy for the happy to make an introduction on anything, any work like that.
And he only wrote one novel, so maybe he either exhausted his muse or said everything he wanted to say. But one novel like that is better than a lifetime of mediocrity.
No James Patterson out there.
No.
He doesn't have scores of writers writing for him.
True. So you like you've said, you often post poetry online. You self-publish collections that are sometimes they're little, some slimmer than others. Sometimes they're thicker. But that begs the question: how do you maintain such a consistent relationship with the muse? What gets you in the mood with the muse?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we touched a little bit on it earlier, but yeah, I mean, like the constant conversation. I mean, I feel like it's it's just a constant. It's something that I'm always trying to get my head around. It's something I'm always trying to engage with and either write above or under or narrate. Um, but yeah, I think as I've gotten older, especially, and this is probably going to be a little bit of a reach, but I was kind of trying to think about this. As a lot of people will tell me like, "Oh, you're so prolific, you're so whatever," but I kind of feel like uh, being cerebral or prolific, sometimes when people tell you those things, they're kind of like backhanded compliments. And I kind of feel like, I think that with, I have three younger brothers. I have four children. My youngest child has a rare, incurable terminal disease. Me and my wife um, are caring for a 15-year-old body constantly, cleaning it, washing it, propping it up. So I feel like especially as I've gotten older, like doing the same thing every day or being in conversation with the same things every day kind of stops aging. And if I don't age, there's a possibility that my prolific here-ness or presence might spiritually protect those I'm worried about. Because if I don't go, they don't go. And I think that's been like, especially since 2009 when my son was diagnosed, I think it's become just something I'm like, I have to do some things that are the same every day and I have to keep doing them. And then I don't feel like things are progressing. And sometimes that's kind of a safe space.
Kind of like a Zeno's arrow where you're attempting to slow, if not stop, time.
Right.
Is there a specific activity that you find more fruitful for writing poetry, or are you one of those people who, they like to be on the shitter, shaving?
Actually, so my most, I write a lot at work. So I have a job where I'm on phones like constantly, and I always have a Word document up, and it's almost, I write my best things at work because I don't have a lot of time to worry about them. It's things kind of have to come out in the way that I have to get them right the first time, sort of, because of the time sensitive environment. And also I don't want to get caught, writing at work. But but
you're like Einstein in the patent office. E equals some poetry.
Right.
You've mentioned in the past that you've misheard song lyrics and that has served as inspiration for you. I mean, you've mentioned death metal. Has there been death metal songs that have birthed some poems for you, or what other types of music aside from the gospels and the anti-gospels?
So yeah, I would say, I mean, as far as death metal lyrics go, that it would have been the opposite because I couldn't always hear what they were saying, so I sought out the the actual lyrics. But
yes,
one example of it, this is going to be embarrassing because I don't know how many people I want to know that I used to like the Gin Blossoms. But I remember the Gin Blossoms had a song called Mrs. Rita, and it was about a fortune teller, so it's even more insanely dumb that I got the lyric wrong. But the lyric was, read my palm and tell me why do lovers come and go. And I always thought the line was, read my poem and tell me why lovers come and go. And I was devastated when I learned that wasn't the actual lyric because I thought that was so great. And I don't know, one more example might be, I don't know if this isn't really a misheard lyric, but I remember I defer a lot to if I feel like there's someone smarter in the room or someone I admire, right? And my brother Noah, I have a brother who's also named Noah, who my son Noah is named after. But anyway, he had gotten a Blind Melon CD and came in and told me, hey, Bart, this song Skinhead is amazing. And he let me hear it, and I read it, and I looked at it, and I remember thinking like, man, I'm glad that Noah heard that song first, because I would have thought that song was called Skinned, but, it's obviously Skinhead if Noah said it. And of course, the song was not called Skinhead. It was Skinned. And he was wrong, but yeah.
Do you think the crux of art is born from miscommunication?
I think often it is. I mean, I'll say, in some of the reflections I write on people's work, where I think I have either hit on something or understood something. Many of the writers who I've written my reflections for, they love them, but they're like, yeah, I never even noticed that about my work. Or I'm like, what? I thought I was like telling you something you already know. So yeah, I think the great there is a great miscommunication, but as long as everybody is there for the right communicative reason, the right the viral intent, or to spread something, then I think that can be that's a positive. Blatant miscommunication or misunderstanding is absolute disinformation and garbage. But if everyone's there for the spreading of it, in a sense of we're all going to get to the bottom of these obsessions, then I think that's a positive.
And like you said, you're always driving toward conversations with others, other works of art, and you're often reading and reviewing contemporary poetry in particular. What are some collections that have stood out to you from that endeavor?
So recently, I would say, I don't know, Action Books is just a wonderful. I'd buy anything they put out sight unseen. But Action Books has a series. It's a translated series. So the names of the 3 books are Outgoing Vessel, Third Millennium Heart, and My Jewel Box, and they're all translated by Katrine Agard Jensen, and they're all written by Ursula Anjakar Olsen.
What did you connect with? What did you admire about these works?
So they're just absolute, like, they'll have like 4 lines on one page, and it's just this constant like conversation with becoming, and it's also in conversation with art itself. And I can't even, I would say that my misunderstanding throughout all 3 books was like at 100. But like I lived in it for a while, and I've never read anything like those 3 things all put together. And I think that going in cold and not really knowing, just knowing the press and knowing some of the people involved, was very important, and very it helped my reading to want to go further, because I wasn't looking for, hey, when's it going to talk about this, or when's it going to be about this. Like they're just absolutely an amazing trinity of books, but that would be the ones that really stand out. They're not too recent. I think the 3rd one came out like a year or 2 ago.
Do you find it rare to come across works that sort of drive you, like you said, to push your work further, or does that happen on a semi-regular basis?
Actually, it happens on a pretty. I'm kind of an impulse buyer. I think, I think some of my stuff ends up being contemporary because, because it's what I'm seeing now and purchasing. I think anything recent to me feels like it's a little less alone. We're in this like notified nowness of this very boring, unobscured capitalist blob of anti-culture. I probably went too far there, but so yeah, I also don't. I know that we're supposed to be writers in one space and readers in another, and you're supposed to support and do this and that, but like I don't buy anything that doesn't or read anything that doesn't look interesting or that I'm going to like. And I don't write reflections on things that don't touch me or move me in some way. I'm not going to give a reader a map on why they should hate or love this book. Like, a lot of my things are more like reactionary, and I'm just trying to kind of impress my own anxiety about reading and having to say something about it. Which I guess you could say is a pretty contemporary way of doing things anyway.
Do you feel hopeful about the current and potentially the future state of poetry? I know that poetry tends to be put on the back burner as far as, novels often sell a lot more than poetry collections,
Right,
for instance.
right. I mean, I'm not really sure where it was before, or so I don't really. I mean, I'll say, reading Natalie Eilbert, Joyelle McSweeney, Annalise Gelman, Sarah Ghazal Ali. These are all authors that have recent books out there that are commenting on what's going on now, and without time stamping, without outdating themselves as soon as they're written. They're in conversation with things that happened before without coming across as antiquated. So, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I think the work is definitely out there, that's speaking to the moment with the moment, as opposed to just like dropping in because it's cool to write about, anti-fascism now or something like that. Like, I think the work is out there. I'm not sure that some of the most popular work is actually going to last that long. But there is work out there that's in conversation with forever, I think.
And when you review or react to these poetry collections that I've seen on Goodreads and elsewhere, it's far from anything like a traditional review or reaction, and you tend to, what I would say essentially is, write a poem in response to the poetry. What's the inclination there versus, plainly speaking, as it were?
I mean, I'd say that, I mean, it's what you said. It's a response. It's like a call and response and a call and a response. Like, I kind of feel like anybody that's ever engaged with my work or said something about it, if it was a response to my work or a continuation of that work, it meant more to me than, someone that was like, well, there's a lot of white space, or there's, which, there is, but yeah, I feel like that's exactly what it is. It's a musical response to what notes the work hit in me, I guess.
I hear you. And zooming out, what is a book that has had the most profound effect on you, whether in your personal life, your writing life, or all of the above?
I would say it would have to be Franz Wright's. I think he had a selected work called Ill Lit. Actually, I don't know if you know who Christopher Taylor is, but he published my first non-self-published work ever, called Infant Cinema.
I mean, that's how we met.
He was
almost he almost published my first novel, but for reasons that we don't need to get into, that didn't happen. But he sent me a copy of Infant Cinema, which I very much enjoy.
Okay. Yeah, so but he had he would send me periodically, like, based on what the book was, how the book was doing. Like, he'd just send me like, $20 in an envelope here and there, saying, had some more sales. And I'm not quite sure. I don't know what his model looked like. But it was always, but he would always send me like, he'd either send me a couple books, or like one time he sent me like this doll that he found at garage sale. An interesting guy, but he sent me Ill Lit by Franz Wright, and I had just begun to get into the work of Franz Wright, and that book rocked me, and I still have it. It's one of the few books that I just pick up and we'll just start reading at any point. Franz Wright was a special guy.
I'll have to check that one out. So I think we've covered basically everything, and I wanted to end with some poems read by yours truly.
Okay.
If you'll do us the honor.
I will try. I'm going to take my glasses off real quick because I'm old. I can't see my own writing. But yeah, I thought I would read. I had a self-published collection come out called Apartures, which is a made-up word. Supposed to be somewhere in between departure and farewell, and being separate. Anyway, there were a bunch
aperture is in there too.
Yeah, true. Aperture is in there as well, which I had some people warn me that when the book came out that I had a typo on the front of it, and I was like, no, that's the actual title, and it's not a real word.
Almost always the risk with wordplay.
Yep. And I made it the title of the book, so maybe that's why it did not sell. But but yeah, there were a bunch of sequences or poems in a sequence, just called Aparture. And I was just going to read a few from that.
Sure thing.
All right. Aparture. Yesterday, distance destroyed its early work. Fog machines fell asleep. I let my son bite me and believed for 3 hours that it was today. You told me underwater about the fog machines. God looked like death, and death saw. 2 misidentified boys in a field of handstands are having a funeral for a bicycle. Their fathers aren't dead, but bring the same car horn to every town. How about that field? I am not crushed when sleep forgets how to hold me. In the shower, I hold a plastic sword. The ways I am here are few. A neighbor kid says that God hates twins and it's going to stick. We are years away from our daughter. After church, a woman hops softly out of her shoes and walks into the high corn. To her, her shoes are missing. Silence has an extra stomach. The bird can scream if you hear it. The year-long field, the eye's blank acre, a stretcher, in snow's most random skull. The baby that crawls into its own stomach beneath an icicle, a sleep that aches from dissolving God. The forgetful shadow of Ohio roadkill, the footprints lost seen from the snowed-in movie of your mother's life, the crushed swimmer at the red typewriter. And that's it.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing with us. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is awesome.
There you have it. If you want more from Barton, feel free to check out my text interview with him on thekaleidoscope.com, and be sure to pick up a copy of his latest collection, Wasp, Gasp. If you'd like early access to content like this and other awesome benefits, such as monthly book picks or editorial services, then consider supporting the Kaleidoscope's efforts through patreon.com/The Kaleidoscope. There's always more content in the works, so stay tuned, and thanks so much for your support. Together, we can make the unheard heard.